So some people have asked me if I believe the United States and China are caught in a Thucydides trap, where we are on a path to war that is unavoidable. And some have pointed out that they may be, but I argue that not only is the United States and China probably not in a Thucydides trap, there is a more likely Thucydides trap that China is dealing with right now, and that is with India. Now, before I get into that, the concept originates from the historian Thucydides and his account of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, in which he noted that the rise of Athens and the fear it instilled in Sparta made the war inevitable. You have a rising power challenging the hegemonic power. This usually works in a regional standpoint. The United States sits as a global superpower, if not a hyperpower, a new standard in creating influence, both soft and hard and sharp, and every other way it's defined across the globe. When it comes to China and India, though, that dynamic and the Thucydides trap there has far greater potential for conflict arising between the rising power, which is India, and the established power in the region, which is China, and that could lead to war. Now, before diving into China versus India, the U.S. has a historical precedent of avoiding Thucydides traps, such as the power dynamic shift from the United Kingdom to the U.S. in the late 19th century and the 20th century. Furthermore, the lessons learned from the Cold War taught us that the United States and Soviet Union demonstrated great powers can engage in long-term strategic competition without direct military conflict. Although currently we are dealing with a Russia that is belligerent to Ukraine, I still just don't think that that is a power dynamic situation between the two countries. Now, you could argue that China and Russia avoided the Thucydides trap earlier in China's rise over the last 25 years, but by that time, Russia was already very much declined after the fall of the Soviet Union, so it wasn't necessarily the same concept. Now, with regard to the India-China situation, the border dispute has been really a source of tension between the two nations for decades. And in recent years, the relationship has become more strained as China continues to assert itself in the Indo-Pacific region, and India tends to remain more neutral and passive. That is not going to last a long time as India continues to rise. In fact, just recently, India passed China in population. Now, the United States still remains a significant player in this region, despite not even being remotely close to it, and has an essential role to play in managing these tensions and ensuring stability as the sole global hyperpower. Now, when I talk about this, you got to look at some of the roots of the conflict here. Now, it traces back to the British colonial era and the McMahon Line, which was drawn in 1914 between British India and Tibet. However, China never accepted the legitimacy of the McMahon Line, and has caused disagreements since then. And the situation escalated in 1962, which was only about 60 years ago, when China launched a military offensive resulting in a brief but pretty bloody conflict that left the border unresolved and tensions simmering. Since then, both nations have made multiple attempts to resolve their differences, and they came to an agreement in 1993 that was called the Agreement on the Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility Along the Line of Actual Control. That's a mouthful. However, that agreement has failed to bring about a lasting peace. There's been recent escalations, even as recent as 2020, when in the Pangong Tso region, which is a lake that's shared between India, Tibet, and China, that the line of actual control passes through. In May of 2020, fistfights and stone pelting broke out along the LAC, and by the end of August of 2020, China had occupied 65 square kilometers of the area and started building infrastructure and increasing its military presence. Both India and China have been using military boats to patrol the lake and in September of 2020, warning shots were fired by both sides. In the Chushul sector, skirmishes expanded, and both sides accused each other of firing warning shots. This was earlier in the year, in May of 2020, and this was the first time warning shots had been fired between the two nations in 45 years. In the Galwan River Valley, thousands of Chinese soldiers were moving to disrupt what was Indian road construction, and they objected to it. So India deployed troops, and the clash resulted in the death of 20 Indian soldiers and an unconfirmed number of Chinese casualties, which heightened tensions and caused further military buildup. In response, both China and India have tried to have diplomatic efforts, but are doing so while continuously increasing their military presence and infrastructure in the contested areas. This remains a very volatile situation. So, as you can see, there is definitely more of a conflict potential with bordering nations, as India is the rising power and China is not only the current power in the region, but they're declining. They're heading on the decline, both economically and demographically, which is inevitably going to cause them to be declining in the overall total power realm, and that's especially relative to India. So the U.S. role in this potential situation focuses solely on India, mainly because India holds more similar views than the U.S. or to the U.S. than China does. They're more of a democratic, free market economy, and they aren't as authoritarian. Yet that remains to be seen going forward. But as of now, they are far less authoritarian than China. And so the U.S. focuses on ties with India. That doesn't mean we ignore China, but expanding military cooperation with India with joint military exercises and the basic exchange and cooperation agreement that was signed in 2020 helped that out. The Quad, which is the quadrilateral security dialogue that includes India, Japan, and Australia, as well as the United States, as a strategic forum, has helped out in countering China in the Indo-Pacific, supporting India's regional initiatives. The U.S. is India's largest trading partner. So having ties to the U.S. is very good for both India and the United States. Now, the United States' largest trading partner is neither China nor India. In fact, it's Canada. And Mexico comes in a second. China and Mexico kind of switch back and forth. So the ability to work with both is critical in a business realm. But when it comes to regional initiatives, it makes sense to support India's deepening ties in the Asia-Pacific economic cooperation, as well as promoting the Blue Dot Network, which is an initiative aimed at improving high-quality infrastructure and investment that the United States can provide for India and reap the benefits, as well as diplomatic efforts. And a lot of times people just broadly say diplomatic efforts, and the problem is diplomatic efforts such as we see with Russia and Ukraine fall apart very quickly. And unfortunately, I think that's a similar situation, trying to be this mediator of the border disputes between India and China. Something the United States can strive for, but likely is just not going to have a whole lot of effect. And the U.S. has to balance China's influence in the region. China has become more belligerent, has become more forceful, and it's what they call the 9-dash line into the South China Sea. So the U.S. enhancing its military cooperation with India, as well as other regional partners such as the Philippines, etc., helps counter this and strengthens India's position, and also making sure that it doesn't necessarily cause a risk of escalation, especially with regard to Taiwan. So all of this is something that the United States has to consider. But in the end, when you look at it in the broad scale and this long-standing dispute between these two countries and the rise of India and the potential future decline of China, you start to see that the Thucydides Trap is playing out more so between those two countries than the United States and China. And that is something that in the regional South China Sea area, Indian Ocean area, will have to be played out over time. But the U.S. definitely has potential for influence in the area.